A while back I ranked the final episodes of Star Trek shows, and while I intended to follow up that video with the same for pilot episodes, I realised at the time I was yet to see Star Trek Prodigy and Strange New Worlds hadn't yet started. But now that I've caught up with both shows, here are Star Trek's pilot episodes ranked from worst to best. We kick things off with Beyond the Farthest Star from Star Trek the Animated Series. Now, as I said in my epilogue of my Star Trek retrospective series, I know this show is beloved by many, but I'm afraid I've never been all that keen on it. Few of the stories ever reach the standard of the original series, and the awkward, cheap animation prevents me from ever truly getting engrossed in the show. Beyond the Farthest Star is a strong inaugural episode though. The Enterprise coming across a derelict alien spaceship and then contending with a shape-shifting monster is a solid premise for a pulpy Star Trek adventure. The only reason I rank it so low is that that's ultimately all the episode ends up being. It's a solid bit of sci-fi fun, but once the 20 minutes are up, it's pretty disposable. I really don't want to upset TAS fans too much. As I said, I know this show means a lot to certain people. I wish I could love it the way those people do, but for me, I think the show in general and its first episode are merely fine. Above that, we have the debut of the Next Generation in Encounter at Farpoint. This really is emblematic of early TNG's teething problems, particularly when it comes to characterization. The biggest problem with this first episode though is the pacing. Encounter at Farpoint was originally supposed to be a standard 1 hour long episode, but was beefed up to a 2-parter. Then when the rough cuts of the first scenes were found to have a much faster pace than anticipated, Roddenberry wrote in literal filler scenes to meet the feature length, and it really shows. After a pretty good first act where the Enterprise meets Q, the episode just grinds to a halt when it reaches Farpoint. It essentially restarts with Riker suddenly serving as the audience POV character and introducing us to characters we've already met. Then it takes seemingly forever for the main characters to figure out what is pretty obvious to the audience. It's a mess, but there are some great things about it. While the characterization is stiff, the performances are generally strong, and John Delancey demonstrates his ability to steal scenes even from greats like Patrick Stewart. The whole thing also looks and sounds great, with high production values, stunning visual effects, and a great score. While The Next Generation would go on to do great things, it's not hard to see why its premiere episode didn't initially get people on board. Next up we have Star Trek Enterprise's Broken Bow. Now don't let this episode's proximity to Encounter at Farpoint misrepresent its quality. This is actually one of the best episodes in Enterprise's first season. It's well paced, it's action packed, the new cast is introduced really well, and it does a really good job of balancing that near future NASA mission aesthetic with the colourful pulp of the original series. Its biggest flaw, however, is the stakes. The Suliban are cool new villains, but their plan to start a Klingon civil war is just pretty difficult to care about. While the mission to stop the Suliban works well as a way for humanity to prove it's ready to explore deep space, it just doesn't resonate emotionally. Whenever I go back and re-watch Enterprise, this is an episode I'm happy to revisit, but it doesn't exactly blow the viewer away. Above that we have Second Contact from Lower Decks. Now Lower Decks has become one of my favourites among the current slate of Star Trek shows, but I wasn't super sold on its first episode. It felt like some of the humour was a little awkwardly integrated, like Rutherford continuing his date in the midst of what looks like a zombie outbreak, but despite that, there are some decent laughs in this one. The animation is vibrant and packed with a lot of energy, the pace is fast, the action is enjoyable, and the character dynamics are immediately solidified. While it doesn't show all of the strengths Lower Decks would eventually reveal, there was still enough of those great elements to keep me interested in watching. Above that we have the original pilot for the original series, The Cage. The Cage is a pretty interesting early vision of Star Trek. Although the actual series has very dated production values, its concepts and style still feel quite modern. The Cage, however, is Star Trek where the influences of things like Forbidden Planet and literature like Skylark is much more apparent. It shows us a Star Trek which very firmly belongs in the 60s, or perhaps even earlier. That being said, there are still a lot of fascinating concepts here. While it is odd to kick off a sci-fi action-adventure show with a story about aliens trying to make Captain Pike horny, the plot does get stuck into some interesting questions about the human condition. It succeeds in establishing the thematic foundation of Star Trek, even if it didn't successfully establish the character and world-building foundations. Even so, it's a tantalizing glimpse at the Star Trek which might have been, and it's no wonder this era of the franchise was later tackled in Strange New Worlds. Overall, The Cage is a swing and a miss, but only a near miss. Near miss is a phrase which also describes our next entry, Caretaker, the first episode of Star Trek Voyager. I see Caretaker almost like a better version of Encounter at Farpoint. It's structurally much more sound, with each of the main characters getting a cohesive and memorable introduction, and the pacing is a lot better as well. Its main weakness, however, is its delivery of the moral conundrum which is meant to strand Voyager in the Delta Quadrant. The Okampa are quite bland, and it's not really clear how the Kazon would use the Caretaker's array to hurt them. The emotional impact of Janeway's decision doesn't land the way it should. Despite this flaw, however, while Encounter at Farpoint was illustrative of TNG's early flaws, Caretaker embodies many of early Voyager's strengths. The conflict between the Starfleet and Maquis crews, for example, is compelling stuff, which is a shame that it's heavily diluted after this episode wraps up. For myself and many others, Voyager is the comfort Star Trek, and that comfort is firmly established in Caretaker. Above that is Lost and Found, the two-part debut of Star Trek Prodigy. Even though Prodigy is clearly a more child-oriented series, I was hoping it was one of those kids shows which could be happily enjoyed by adults as well, and thankfully I was right. Whereas Lower Decks took a couple of episodes to fully get into the swing of things, Prodigy nailed it right off the bat. It's visually spectacular, and seeing the Star Trek universe from a totally alien perspective is really refreshing. The characters are all striking in design, and the way their personalities connect and clash is endlessly fun to watch. While it disposes with many of the familiar Star Trek tropes, it still embodies the spirit of Star Trek, with the protostar literally symbolizing hope and optimism, which is Star Trek's bread and butter after all. It's packed with action, humour, and great characterization. It's a show I'd happily watch with younger siblings, but honestly, I can enjoy it just as well as a solo adult. Getting into the top 5 now with the first episode of Star Trek Picard, Remembrance. It surprises me more than anyone else that this show is actually my least favourite of the current slate, and while Season 2 was a total mess and Season 1 had a weak ending, the first outing for Picard after 20 years is a terrific reintroduction. Patrick Stewart is on fine form as ever, portraying the iconic character in a new and refreshing way. The mystery surrounding Dahj is intriguing, the way the Star Trek universe has advanced is surprising, and in general it's a brilliant hook for the story to come in Season 1. It's a shame that story got a bit fumbled in the end, but this first episode showed a hell of a lot of promise. Inching out ahead of Picard is the premiere of its preceding show, the Vulcan Hello / Battle of the Binary Stars from Star Trek Discovery. Similar to Picard, while Discovery's first season had its issues, it kicked things off extremely well. The episodes look and sound incredible, feeling truly cinematic even in an era where television production values had shot up dramatically. But at its best, these first 2 episodes feel eerily reminiscent of Deep Space Nine on a thematic level. Burnham's desperation to try and save her captain and her crew, butting heads with Starfleet idealism, opens up some captivating storytelling avenues, and Sonequa Martin Green bounces off Michelle Yeoh terrifically. This debut is ultimately the deepest of tragedies, bringing Burnham and Starfleet as a whole to their darkest moments so they can triumph later on. While the exploration of its ideas stumbled in the first season, that journey began in fine form. Going back to the original series, however, we come to the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before. It's easy to see why Star Trek got off the ground following this pilot rather than The Cage. Despite The Cage's strengths, it's pretty slow and kinda weird. Where No Man Has Gone Before similarly explores the human condition, but with a great deal more excitement and emotion. William Shatner's Captain Kirk is much more charismatic and likeable when compared to Pike in The Cage. The bond between Kirk and Gary Mitchell gives the story some emotional weight as well, and heightens the dramatic tension in the final fight. While it has the look and feel of a series from its time, this episode really established the formula which would allow Star Trek to continue well into the future. Fitting then that our next episode is Strange New Worlds from Strange New Worlds. Ever since Anson Mount stole the show in Discovery's second season, the hype for this show was strong, and its first episode delivered on that hype. It feels like the best of the original series, The Next Generation, and the modern shows combined. It's colourful and fun, while also being heartfelt and moving. It isn't afraid to go to darker places, but remains radically hopeful for the future. Strange New Worlds' first episode feels like quintessential Star Trek, while also exploring familiar places and characters in new and exciting ways. While the best of Season 1 was yet to come after this, this first episode really threw down the gauntlet for the show in the best way possible. Which means taking the top spot is Emissary from Deep Space Nine. I've said many times that DS9 is my favourite Star Trek show, but I was kinda surprised that I put this at number 1, because in many ways Emissary shares the same flaws as Encounter at Farpoint and Caretaker. An inconsistent pace, the characters not all being established well, etc. But this first episode perfectly establishes DS9's gripping departures from the comforts of TNG. The conflict between the main characters, the setting of a rundown backwater station, and the brutality of its conflicts. Most of all though, this is the Star Trek pilot which has the biggest emotional impact. The moment Sisko breaks down in tears over the pain of losing his wife just gets me every single time I watch it. The conclusion of the episode is still a hopeful one, but in Deep Space Nine that optimism isn't a given, it has to be fought for. And while the episode shows us that can be a difficult battle, it also shows us it's a battle which can still be won. What do you think of my ranking? Do you agree, disagree, do you have your own ranking? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you like my videos, be sure to like, subscribe and share, and make sure to hit the bell icon to stay up to date with all of my new uploads. If you want to help the channel grow, join my Patreon or YouTube members using the links down below. There you can see videos early as well as some exclusive content. Speaking of which, I'd like to quickly thank all of my patrons and members who are now appearing on screen. Have a good one, and as always, live long and prosper.